All right, so hello everyone. So we're going to be debating about utilitarianism with Ben Burgis, who writes for Jacobin and is a philosophy professor, and also has a YouTube channel, the link to which I forgot to put in the description, but I'll put it after the video airs. Yeah, so I mean, I think just all I mean, I obviously won't give my whole case for utilitarianism, but just I think utilitarianism explains a lot of our moral intuitions pretty well. I think it does well in terms of theoretical virtues, and I think that what we find is that the alleged counterexamples to utilitarianism actually end up favoring utilitarianism. They end up being sort of like with scientific theories when they make predictions that we didn't otherwise expect, but then when we investigate them, they turn out to be correct. I think that when we carefully reflect on the alleged counterexamples to utilitarianism, they end up actually not being counterexamples at all. They end up actually confirming utilitarianism. And so we'll presumably discuss some of the alleged counterexamples and get into the details.
Sure. I don't know how you want to start this out. I mean, I can kind of describe my own views a little bit, maybe
Yeah.
at the outset. So, so I think that when we're arguing about ethics, I think that what we're doing is we're trying to bring our moral feelings into some kind of reflective equilibrium, that we're trying to bring them into a internally consistent picture. And I would argue that's like really the only thing that we could do when we're arguing about ethics or normative subjects in general, right? My starting point is taking the Humean point about facts and values pretty seriously, and to the point that I'm pretty skeptical about the idea that there's some sort of moral reality to which we have any access other than moral intuitions, because I pretty much think it's constant. I mean, if you want to talk that way, right, that they're moral facts, those would be kind of constituted by those feelings in some way. So in terms of what kind of schmancy philosophical framework to sort of codify that rough intuitive picture in, I'm a little bit more agnostic about. I'm attracted to things like quasi-realism a la Simon Blackburn, or maybe Gil Harman's sort of quasi-objectivist view about ethics, unrelated to objectivism in the bad sense. And I think, like views according to which, like, what we're really doing, right? The sort of subject matter is, values, commitments that we can have a discussion about, because with any luck, there's enough there that's shared, that you can influence people to, say, oh, drop this value commitment in favor of this deeper one that it turns out that you also have, or, just because out of inconsistency with a bunch that might be more shallowly rooted, but collectively have the power to uproot something else, right? So that's the sort of that would be the kind of view that I take about meta ethics. As far as normative ethics goes, I guess I'd just say two things just to get us rolling before we start really getting into utilitarianism, which are, one, I think that it's a mistake to try to have a unified theory of like personal virtue, interpersonal morality on the one hand, and social justice on the other. My starting bias is that those are really different things. That what we think makes something a good social institution and what we think makes a person a good person, are both broadly moral concepts, but I think they're very different kinds of moral concepts. I think that I think interpersonal morality is appropriately partialistic, that that it's not wrong to sort of prioritize your own interests or the interests of your loved ones to a point, that whereas good social institutions, what makes them, like, I think it's very much in the nature of what makes them good that they're completely impartial. And so I think good social institutions are ones that that promote certain kinds of egalitarian outcomes. We can get into the details of what I think that
Yeah.
that looks like. I think that like my
I think that we have sort of enough, we're
Yeah.
discussing a sufficiently wide range of normative judgments that it
Yeah.
may make sense to not go too much into political
Yeah, no,
philosophy.
that's fair. That's fair, right? But they have but that's where I'm coming from. I'll just say that I actually here maybe this could be the last thing, right? That I say in this initial part of the discussion, that I think that it's um that when it comes to political philosophy, I tend to think that what's right about utilitarianism, what I find intuitively compelling about it, uh, I, I tend to think is better captured by something like Rawls's framework, which I think sort of takes certain kinds of consequences into account in an appropriate way, but still sort of focuses on the individuals, the unit of moral evaluation in a certain way that's important, that I think gets lost, at least in sort of classical maximizing uh, utilitarianism. And I will say, I should also just lay down my one of my big biases about this, right? Which is that I sort of have 2 points of entry into this. One is just sort of, being a philosophy nerd. And so of course I have views about all this stuff. But then the other one, right, that is, I think oftentimes people, since I do spend most of my time thinking about ethics, thinking about, politics and political theory, that I think that oftentimes people who, like me, reject certain kinds of normative claims about property rights, for example, that would be used to defend the status quo, end up sort of gravitating to utilitarianism because it seems like a very sort of simple and compelling story, right? I mean, like if you see like Sam Cedar, for example, who I like, talk about utilitarianism, right? He's sort of attracted to it for that reason, because he's sort of like, look, here's how I tend to think about things when I think about politics. This seems to fit, right? So there you go.
I'm
And I
trying
think
to point out that Thanos was a utilitarian in this discussion, or I'll just get totally wrecked.
yeah. No, if I'm
like the villain in most movies.
That's right. So, and I want to, in some ways, I sort of feel like it's important to save people from thinking that they need to do that, because from my perspective, it's like I think there is a lot that's very counterintuitive about utilitarianism, and I don't. A lot of my thinking about this is about how to sort of say, look, you can take what's good about that without having to sort of go all the way to the point of biting all those bullets about I don't actually think that what Thanos did is probably going to work out well, the utility calculus, but they have but but the actual bullets, like the pushing people onto trolley tracks, and the harvesting organs, and and all of that stuff, right? I think you can tell a coherent story that avoids all of that while capturing what's maybe plausible about the view.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of these alleged counterexamples or bullets. So one of the ones that you mentioned previously in our private correspondence that I think is very much worth discussing, largely because I have a lot to say on the subject, is the repugnant conclusion. So just for background, for those who are unaware, for some reason, I don't know why you're not familiar with random, relatively obscure philosophy thought experiments, but so the repugnant conclusion is, suppose that we have a population with 10 billion people living awesome lives. It turns out that on utilitarianism, you could have a better state of affairs with, rather than 10 billion people with awesome lives, just some vast number of people with lives that are barely worth living, let's say 10 quadrillion. And yet, for most people, it seems strange to convert utopia to just this sort of world where people's lives are barely positive, where there are just a quadrillion of them. And so, people find this one unintuitive. Though I think that even if I weren't a utilitarian, I think we have really good reason to accept this. I think that it is, as Michael Huemer said, one of the only non-trivial theorems that's been definitively proved in all of ethics. So, I mean, just to lay out sort of one basis for accepting it. So, there are a couple of axioms that if we accept all of them, the repugnant conclusion, or so it's called, I don't think it's very repugnant, will follow, which is, so the first one is, I'm actually blanking on the name of it, but the basic idea is, suppose you have a world and you make everyone who currently exists better off, and then you add new people with positive lives. That making everyone better off and adding new people with positive lives makes the world better. Do you accept that? You're muted.
I think it's somewhat plausible. I am politely skeptical of anybody who claims to have a strong intuitive response to this one way or the other. I think it's too abstract for anybody to really have a much intuitive hold on it, pro or con.
Well, so I mean, I think that, I mean, I think your intuitions are very different from mine, and it seems very different from most of the people who have considered it, because it seems like most of the people who have, who have presented this have admitted that it at least has a good amount of prima facie plausibility. And it's not, it follows from a principle called modal Pareto, which is that if you have two worlds, and one of those worlds is better for everyone who is in the other world. So there's no one who's made worse off by something. Then that's a better world. And that seems really plausible, making everyone better off and then making new people whose lives are net positives. That doesn't make things, that makes things better. I mean, it seems like making people better off is certainly better. And it seems like adding people who have positive qualities of life is at least not bad. And so if we accept this sort of minimal principle, which is that making everyone better off and then adding new people with good lives, that's a good thing. I mean, I guess you can reject the intuition, but
yeah, I would just say it sounds like the kind of thing that might be true, but I have a hard time imagining finding the rejection of that like intuitively outrageous. I mean, it just sounds like mildly plausible. Like, sure, that could be true, but that doesn't sound like much of a bullet to bite to say that's not true.
Well, okay, so I mean, so what we've seen is that the principle has prima facie plausibility, and it stems from another plausible principle, which is the modal Pareto principle. That if a world is better, if world B is better for everyone who is in world A than world A, there's no one who's worse off than world B is actually better. That seems like a principle that's hard to deny. Though, I mean, we'll see that this is just one of a multitude of ways of justifying the repugnant conclusion. But I mean, I think just for those in the audience, really just consider this proposition and see if to you it seems like the type of thing that could be false. That making everyone better off and then adding new people with good lives, that's a good thing.
It just sounds like something, again, like if first reaction, is that plausibly true? Sure. Is that like definitely true? Is it the kind of thing that can't plausibly be false? That seems like a stretch to me.
Well, okay, but I mean, in terms of just, at least for me, and I think that this is true for most. Well, it's certainly true for me. We know true for Michael Huemer. Now, it's not clear, and it seems like this is true for most people who've considered it, given that it seems like really delving into the repugnant conclusion literature does move the needle considerably towards the repugnant conclusion. They at least find this principle to be more plausible than the rejection of the repugnant conclusion, particularly because, I think plausibly our intuitions about quadrillions of people are the type of thing that are not going to be reliable. And I mean, I think that, this is the type of thing where I guess if you're in the grips of the theory, where you're sort of theoretically committed to rejecting the repugnant conclusion, then you can always say, well, that's going to be more intuitive. But I think that if you just went up,
all I can say is that I have a very strong intuitive response to the repugnant conclusion itself, and maybe this is just eccentric, or there's something wrong with me, but I don't have a very strong response one way or the other to the principle. It just seems too abstract to have to be like, oh, that's just obviously true, right? It's like, yeah, sure, that could be true, but it's like that seems like something that, like, out of the two, right? The idea that the world with 100 billion people whose lives are just barely worth living is worse than the world with 10 billion people whose lives are all awesome. Are all
Well,
awesome.
wait. You did the math wrong. So 100 billion people versus 10 billion. I think the math, like, if lives that are barely worth living are not 10% as good as awesome lives. And I actually think that this is sort of, I mean, it would depend on exactly, but I mean, the way I think of it is that, in the repugnant conclusion, their lives are just very minimally good. So, one way of thinking of it, that people just spawn into existence, like eat a slice of cake and then disappear. And then some amount of that is more valuable than, but I mean, I actually think that, the fact that I think that, like, it's really we know that our intuitions about very large numbers are not particularly reliable. And so, I mean, the fact that, the fact that, in the original formulation, I talked about like maybe a quadrillion people, and you moved it down to 100 billion, as if that didn't make a significant difference.
Okay, I just forgot the numbers. I don't have.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm also very skeptical. Anytime anybody tries to quantify this stuff, that they like it. I think it's. I just don't think it's the kind of thing that could be. I don't think anybody really has a good psychological hold on what it is. Like on what 10%, of the awesome life is, or what 1% of it is. It's so that might explain why I wasn't keeping track of which numbers that you used earlier. But I mean, I think that the trade-off is the one that's actually made. I mean, maybe not with enough the appropriate numbers to make it work, but like, the trade-off is what's actually made. Like, if you just have more prosperous societies where you tend to have lower birth rates because because people aren't worried about who's going to take care of them in their old age, etc. That that you have a smaller population with better lives, and that doesn't seem obviously undesirable. Like it doesn't even seem like, well, it's good that we have all the things that generate it, but it's a shame that we then have the smaller population. Like that's maybe it is, right? But I mean, like, certainly on the face of it, it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, I mean, the point wasn't to go for like a gotcha that you got the numbers wrong. The point was just that the fact that our intuitions are not considerably different between 100 billion and a quadrillion, when, I don't know exactly what a quadrillion divided by 100 billion is. I could do the math, but I think it's 10,000 to 1 maybe. But I mean, generally, if one thing has 1/10,000th the value of something else, if we intuitively regard them as about equally good, I think that that's a reason to think that our intuitions in the matter are likely to be unreliable.
Yeah, I mean, I think our intuitions are also unreliable at the level of abstraction within which those principles about comparing worlds are presented in the first place, which is why it's so important to discipline those into with cases where we almost invariably have much clearer intuitions.
Well, sure. I mean, but we could convert the principle into a case. So imagine if you had you added more people with good lives to this world, as well as making everyone's life better. To make this palatable for you, let's say that you give everyone universal health care. So it makes everyone's life better, and you add new people who have good lives. That universal healthcare world plus the new people, but that would be a better world.
The fact that it's the universal healthcare, that certainly makes it a better world. I think that should be considered in isolation from whether the universal healthcare world with no extra people versus the universal healthcare people world with a bunch of extra people whose lives were just barely okay. I think I think those would have to be considered separately, right? I also think the intuition that we have. I mean, I agree. It's not responsive to the difference between the scale, because once you get up to a sufficiently large scale, then the differences sort of fail to register. I think that's true, right? But I think the underlying intuition is that the sort of sheer number of people who are living lives were barely worth living can't be the kind of thing that matters when we're asking, like, is it better to have that or a smaller population with much better lives?
Yeah. So okay, we can move on to talking about the second axiom.
All right.
So this is non-anti-egalitarianism. So the basic principle is if you have one world that has higher average utility, higher total utility, and a more equal distribution of utility than another world, then it's actually a better world.
Mm-hmm.
Does that strike you as true?
Yeah, I mean, again, that this seems like something a little bit.
Well, wait, sorry, just
Sure.
to be clear, sorry,
Sure.
I formulated it incorrectly.
Yep.
A better world merely with respect to utility. So maybe you think that there are rights
Sure.
violations, so it's a worse world, but just in terms of merely talking about the utility.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the kind of thing. Again, I'm not trying to be difficult here, but I'm just trying to report my reactions to these as scrupulously as I can. I think I have a hard time getting a clear reaction to, because we're like jumbling together two or three things at once, and I think that sort of confuses any possible intuitive response to it. Like that they have, like we could look at each of those things in isolation maybe, and say that and have a reaction to it, but I'm not quite sure why we're trying to consider and have a reaction to, which seems psychologically difficult to do, to get into all three elements at once, or however many elements there were.
So consider the three tenets of it. So first is having higher total utility. Presumably having higher total utility is prima facie good, right? Like just all else equal, we want more total utility. Maybe there are some exceptions, but like just in general, more utility is good. As Sam Cedar says, less suffering is good. We want that. And then higher average utility, that's also the type of thing that that seems plausibly good, right? And so in order for you to think that the world is worse that has higher average utility, total utility, and more equal distribution of utility, you actually have to think that there's something actively bad about egalitarianism, about equalizing utility. And knowing facts about you, I know that would not be your judgment on the subject. You tend to think that egalitarianism
is a
good thing.
I definitely think egalitarianism is a good thing. I am a little bit unclear on why, like, that's the I mean, is the idea just that, like, these are the only three pieces of information we're being given about the differences between the two worlds? So if you think it's worse, you have to pick one. Is that the form of the argument here, or am I missing something?
Well, the form of the argument is that if we're comparing two worlds with respect to utility, and one of them has a higher average utility, total utility, and more equal distribution of utility, then just taking into account utility, then that's a better world. And this seems like a plausible principle. Yeah,
because those are the only three ways you can compare utility.
Yeah, I mean, it's not clear. I mean, I guess you can.
I mean, they could be. I'm just asking for clarification.
Yeah, I mean, there are other things that you could, in theory, care about utility, but none of these seem to, like. I mean, you could, in theory, care about, just want to maximize the mode utility or something. But in terms of just the things with respect to utility that people seem to care about in their writings on the subject, lots of people are very concerned about how egalitarian things are. Lots of people are very concerned about total utility, and then some wackos are concerned about average utility. And so this is basically just saying, look, like, if it's better in all three of these regards, which seem to be the thing that we care about utility, then it's a better world. And so, this seems really plausible.
Okay.
Yeah, and so then the third thing that we have to accept, or I guess we don't have to accept it, but that if we accept it, then the repugnant conclusion follows, as William Lane Craig says, logically and inescapably, is transitivity. So if A is better than B is better than C, then A is better than C. Do you accept that?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds right. I know, like, Larry Temkin denies that and has written a bunch about this. Again, I think it sounds, I mean, sure. I mean, I think first reaction, it sounds correct. I mean, if there's no, I do wonder about in respect to utility, as whether that's sort of disguising ambiguities, right? Because, like, that sort of assumes there's sort of one thing that we're talking about. We talk about with respect to utility, we might care, about different kinds of utility. They might not come together into a single concept. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but yeah. I mean, I think that
Well,
that's
but if there are multiple things that we care about utility, where like there are different types of utility,
yeah.
assuming that we can make evaluative judgments about how much we compare, about how we weigh between different types of utility. As long as that's true,
Maybe.
then it,
Which also I have to say seems pretty unlikely to me. But they have but I think that even if like I think it could be that I mean the only concern here is that we don't want it to be like, well, world B is when we judge world B to be better than world A, we're thinking of, in respect to utility, we're thinking of one kind of utility, and when we judge world C to be better than world B, we're thinking about a different kind of utility, in which case, even if you accept
well,
transitivity
so
principles, they should be pegged to a particular kind
well,
of utility, and you shouldn't accept that. But look, out of the three, I mean, I agree that all three, sound initially plausible. I don't think that any of them are I don't find that my intuitive reaction to any of them is as strong as my intuitive reaction to the repugnant conclusion itself. Maybe that's unusual. I'd actually love to see some polling on that to see if people can think that they have like a think it seems more obvious that any of those three are true than that the repugnant conclusion would in fact be repugnant.
But okay, so to me, all of those principles seem considerably more obvious, and this is
That's
so. I
interesting.
mean, what?
Oh, I said that's fascinating.
I mean, I also
Yeah,
just don't
not to
really.
me.
I also just don't really have any like negative intuitive reaction to the repugnant conclusion.
Okay.
Though, I mean, I guess I mean, there have been a few times throughout my life when I'm reading like people trying to make it sound horrible, and I've had the momentary intuition that it sounds horrible. But I
Well,
think
I
so.
mean,
If we
you did
have,
appeal and laid out the three principles. You did appeal to sort of most people, who've thought about this, find these three premises plausible. Surely that
yeah,
most people who've had opinions about the repugnant conclusion find it pretty repugnant.
yeah, but it seems like the people there
So
has been
so at that point, the question is like, assuming that the attitudes of most people who've thought about this are intuitively yes on those three and intuitively no on the
yeah.
repugnant conclusion would be fine, then the question, if we're trying to do reflective equilibrium here, the question is like, which is like at least the first question, right, is like which is a stronger reaction,
Yeah.
is it, do most people feel more confident that those three principles are right, or do they feel more confident that the repugnant conclusion was repugnant?
Yeah, sure. So, well, I think that that is certainly one relevant consideration. Though a couple of points are worth making. One of them is
Mm,
that this is only about a 10% of my case for accepting the
mm.
repugnant conclusion so far. There are lots
Okay.
of other, I think, good reasons to accept the
Okay.
repugnant conclusion. But also, I think that we've seen some good reasons to think that our intuitions about the repugnant conclusion are the types of intuitions that we would expect not to be super reliable. So we know that we know that people are not very good at compounding small numbers.
Mm,
We
mhm.
know that people's intuitions about very large numbers are not super reliable. And it's also hard to have a strong intuitive sense of what a life that's barely worth living is.
Yeah.
That's barely above the waterline, such that it's still overall positive, but is not very positive. There's also the potential for egocentric bias. So if we imagine ourselves as being part of one of the worlds, it's easy to say, well, you'd rather be part of the non-repugnant
Yeah, I
conclusion.
would see that not as a bias, but as a correct instance of Rawlsian moral reasoning.
Well, so if we apply, so I don't think that can be applied to. So if we take into account the possible people as people who we could be behind the veil of ignorance, who may just not exist, then I think that flips the Rawlsian consideration. And if we don't, then we get something very much like average utilitarianism, maybe with some Rawlsian.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think
Um,
that I don't think you can compare. There is nothing to compare in the case where you don't exist. I don't think so. I don't think we could have I don't think it is appropriate moral reason to just say, well, okay, would I rather, not exist, or would I rather have this life? Because there just is nothing to compare in the non-existence case. I mean, it's like the same thing
Well,
that's wrong with the ontological argument, right? You don't have a version of God who has all these properties but doesn't exist because there just is nothing there to compare, right? That there's, and I'd say similar things here. I mean, what you
well,
should be.
there's a possible entity who doesn't actually exist. But and I think that there's actually a knockdown argument. So would you say that we should rationally be indifferent between creating a person with positive utility and creating a person and not creating anyone? So if we're like deciding if someone's deciding to have a child, that just morally independent of any joy that children bring or
Yeah,
detract
I
from
mean
their lives.
that's an interesting question. I'm not
Because if
100%. I'm not 100% sure. I will say that usually when I'm thinking about this, when I'm thinking about merely possible people, it's in the context of thinking about of thinking about like abortion and contraception and all of that stuff. And usually my assumption is that there's that like merely potential people don't have any particular moral status, right? That we can, that like the sort of thing that the sort of thing that veil of ignorance reasoning is good for, is like seeing whether there's anybody who's going to be in existence whose interests are being unfairly disregarded in some way, right? And whereas like I think that if you're I guess my initial, again, I think that just like your point about intuition breaking down with very large numbers, I my general bias at least is to think that that moral intuitions with regard to extremely abstract principles aren't worth very much, right? That they have a that like
this is
we we
this
we
is not
we have the clearest moral intuitions
this is not a very abstract principle. It's a question that many people face, which is they're deciding whether or not to have a kid. They think their
yeah
kid will live a good life.
yeah
They think that they'll be about equally happy if they
yeah.
have or don't have the kid. Should they have the
Well,
kid?
that's never. I mean, that's never a question anybody faces, right? That's the.
Well, okay, sure, but that is
I mean,
certainly that's certainly the type of
I mean, it's
thing.
perhaps a
That
question
is
we
less
could
that is less
hypothetically
far.
imagine
It is That's
somebody.
certainly less far from like real world cases and from things that we can coherently imagine than like the repugnant conclusion where we're
Yeah.
asking about whether we design a population with 1 billion people or a quadrillion people.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think the intuition there is that the sort of is that the kind of the kind of lives that the people are enjoyed or not enjoyed is the relevant conclusion, and how many of them there are can't really be very relevant at all. It can't really make up
Okay,
for it.
so
I mean,
okay, so so
again, I don't think, like, in the normal course of things, I wouldn't think that anybody had like a moral reason, that anybody has like a moral reason to have a kid uh for the sake of the kid, right? That they have
okay,
that like
great.
because you're
So
bringing into existence somebody who wouldn't otherwise exist. I mean, that's maybe I should, right? But I have to say I could never recall having that thought. I mean, maybe most
well,
people do. I
okay,
don't think so.
okay, great. So you accept the principle that you have, if you're deciding whether or not to have a child with positive utility or a child with
Or not have a child.
or not have a child, then you have no moral reason to choose one or the other.
I'm at least initially sympathetic towards it.
Okay,
The
cool.
contrary wouldn't have occurred to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So now let's say that let's say you can have a child who will live 40 years and have a good life. You know that
Yeah.
they'll die at 40,
Okay.
and then they will die. You think that it's a coin flip between that and not having a child at all, right? That's
Right.
your moral reason to do those.
No, I see your point. I mean, I think that
Wait, so can I just make the point for those in the audience who are less
oh,
receptive?
sure. I mean, I hadn't actually gotten to saying what I think about that case, but sure, make your point. Yeah.
Well, no, just tell me what you think about the case, rather
Yeah,
than
yeah.
trying to adduce like my
So
points.
my initial inclination would be to say that you do have a moral reason not to do that, and I get your point, because that you're that like now I am comparing non-existence to existence, and that's a good point. I'd have to think about that.
Okay, yeah. So I think I'll leave in the link to the description of an article that I've written about, because I think that the view that you shouldn't make that you should make people happy, not make happy people. Well, it's an awesome slogan. I think that much like you own your own body and other like libertarian slogans, it's just wildly implausible across a variety of cases. Because if you say that you have no reason to create a happy person, then if you can either create a person with an awesome life or a person with a mediocre life, if both of them are morally equal to not creating anyone, then it's a coin flip between the two of them. And yet, having a child, if you could either have a child who would live a good life or have a child who would live a bad life, then you would have a reason to have a child who would have a good life. And actually, if you don't hold that view, then it would follow that we have no reason to care about climate change policy for the benefits of future generations, because climate change policy for the benefit of future generations will change the future people that exist, because it'll change when people have sex.
Yeah, I don't think that does follow. And by the way, I actually I think libertarians are wrong about most things, but I'm not sure they're wrong about the one that you just mentioned. But okay.
Well, okay. My point was that. Well, okay, sure. I mean, we can dispute.
I mean, that one you could nitpick exactly what they mean by it, but I think there is something that's very right about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can have a more in-depth discussion about this, but just I think, and the moral space is so vast. There's so much terrain to cover. But just for those who are interested, I'd recommend looking into the non-identity paradox, which is the view, the thing that I described briefly. Okay, so now let's talk about.
I do just want to say for 10 seconds, like on the climate change point, because I think this is important, right? I think that I think you can believe that it's wrong to inflict suffering on people who don't exist yet, without thinking that people who merely might exist have moral status such that like they have a right to be brought into existence or anything like that.
Well, but so if you think that climate change, the people who will be born in the future will not actually be made better off because of our climate change policy, given that if it hadn't been for our climate change policy, it would have changed when people have sex such that they wouldn't have existed. So they're not actually better off. But the thing is, the reason why we should do things about climate change is because they're less well off than the other version of them would have been. But if you say that there's no reason to create a person with a good life, then if we're choosing between creating a person in a climate change infested hellhole and a non-climate change infested hellhole, which is what we end up deciding when we decide what to do about climate change, then we would have no moral reason to choose one or the other.
I don't think that follows. I think that you could have a moral reason to say that that it would be better to bring people into existence who have better lives than to bring people into existence who have worse lives, without saying that it's better to bring people into existence with good lives than to just not bring them into existence.
Well, okay, no, but so if you say that if we stipulate that they'll both have positive lives overall, then if you say that bringing about a person in a climate change or in a world where there's lots of climate change, that's just as good as not bringing anyone into existence, and also that bringing into a person into existence in a world where we're not hugely affected by climate change, that's also equal to non-existence. And by transitivity,
the mistake in that argument is that it's assuming that that we're saying that there is a certain moral value to not bringing people into existence that would then be equivalent to both of these. Therefore, they're both equivalent to each other. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if you go with this, with the sort of principle that I think sounds at least somewhat plausible. Again, I'm not certain about this, but they have that you just say that's not the kind of thing, like the sort of just not bringing people into existence isn't the kind of thing that could be morally evaluated at all. So it's not that it has some value that's equal to these other two. Therefore, by transitivity, they're equal to each other. It's just we're saying it's not. There's nothing there to be evaluated. That's a very different view.
Well, but if we're deciding between the two of them, if we're deciding between A and B, and you think that we have no reason to choose A over B, and we're deciding between B and C, and you think that there's no reason to choose one over the other, and by transitivity, that's
wrong. Like this is really importantly wrong. Like so saying that, you know, saying that that B is neutral, right? That it's not the kind of thing that has a moral valence at all. So like there's just nothing there to be compared to either A or C. Doesn't mean that A and C aren't both substantive things that could be compared to each other, right? I mean, if I say, like, again, think about that classic objection to the ontological argument for the existence of God. You know, if I say that a version of God who is all powerful is better than a version of God who's like almost all powerful, that could make sense. But you know, you can't really say that either of them is better or worse than a version of God who has the property of non-existence, because there just is no version of God that has the property of non-existence.
I think that is not a correct response to the ontological argument. I think there are many correct responses to the ontological argument.
Okay.
No, but look,
so you might disagree with it. The point is just the structure of the move isn't that, like, you're not saying, like, it would be a silly response to that objection to the ontological argument to say, well, if a version of God that's almost all powerful is no better than a version of God who has the property of non-existence, and if a version of God is completely all powerful is no better than the version of God that doesn't have property of non-existence, therefore by transitivity those two must have the same value as each other. I think that response would just miss the point, right? The point is that the claim that's being made is that there just is nothing there to compare with either one. That doesn't mean you can't compare the two with each other. I mean, there's no there's no way for a transitivity move to get off the ground. There's nothing there to compare.
Look, so what you're saying that there's nothing there to compare. But what you've said, so the thing is, in hypothetical situations, we have to actually make comparisons when we're deciding between bringing about A and B. And so in that case, you say, because there's nothing there to compare in some sense, we should be indifferent between bringing about a person with a good life and not bringing about anyone. So if you accept that we should be indifferent between those two things, even if you think one of them is not comparable in some sense, given that you are and have accepted that it can be compared, that if we compare it to A, that's at least a metaphysically possible thing we can do. You know, we can imagine making the choice between having a person.
But you're not comparing them, right? You're comparing decisions, right? You know,
we're comparing the choice. Well, okay. The fact that we're comparing decisions is entirely immaterial, because we can make it. Then we can make it so that the decision is such that we're comparing decisions rather than comparing outcomes.
Okay, but I think you can compare the decisions because of their impact on you, right? Which is what people standardly do, right? You know, they have we could compare the decisions because you'd find it like a really meaningful thing to do or a really fulfilling thing to do.
Okay, but we're comparing the decisions
to have kids, but you're not. You know, like the core intuition here would be that that how happy or unhappy somebody who might exist would be, right? Yeah, that's morally relevant. They have whether or not somebody exists in the first place is not morally relevant. So of course, if we're comparing two different scenarios where there are different groups of people and they're happy or unhappy to one extent or another, right? Of course, we can make a moral determination about that, but that you can't make a moral determination.
But now you're changing the subject, because now you're talking about the prudential reasons based on the impact on you. But what we were talking about was just if you're deciding, holding all else equal, if you're deciding between having no child or having a child with an awesome life, you have said that you think that putting aside that just looking at the impact on the child, you have no reason to choose one or
you have no reason based on the impact of the child, right? And so what I was just offering was like the reasons that you have, you know, the separate reasons that you might have, right? That's all fine,
sure,
right?
Right. Yeah, we're talking about just the impact on the child, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So, but you also, if you're now let's say you were offered 1 penny to or let's say you would benefit someone else slightly if you didn't have the child. So I think the child would make one person slightly worse off, no one better off. And presumably you would hold that you shouldn't have the child, right? Because you think that having the child is that there's no moral that having the child and not having the child are morally valued.
Well, there's no moral reason from the perspective of the child to have the child or not have the child. There could be a moral reason from the perspective of you. It could be that this is a tremendously fulfilling thing, for you to do, and you have a
Yeah,
right to
right.
do.
Look, so we're not. So right now
Well,
we're just discussing the impact on the child.
Well,
Right? So
sure,
you don't
but
need
I think the intuition that it would be crazy to say I'm not going to have a child because this one person is, one penny better off, is assuming that the only
no,
things okay,
no. Sorry, that's not the intuition.
okay,
That I'll explain the intuition.
okay,
Because I agree that view is perfectly at
yeah,
least sounds superficially totally reasonable. But so now one thing that's worth noting is that now you are doing comparisons. You say that it's equally good to create a person with positive utility to a person who doesn't have positive utility. And so if you made it
it's
so
equally good to do what?
that creating a person with a positive utility
Is equally good to what?
to not creating anyone.
Oh no, I didn't say that. I just think that there is no, like, if from the perspective of the impact on the child, there simply is no point of comparison. We can't do a comparison. It's not the same. It's not different. It's there just is nothing to compare about.
But you were perfectly willing to do a comparison when you talked about if there was a 1 cent cost to someone else. The thing is,
No. Actually, so if it sounded that way, I was being unclear. I am not at all doing a comparison from the point of view of the child about the 1 cent cost. I think that I think that, like, any comparison we could do is going to be about, well, this is the, like, whatever your reasons are, separate from the utility of the future child for having a child versus the
okay.
1 cent benefit to somebody else. You have a right to have a kid if you
Right.
if
I
you want to have a
saying
kid.
that I wasn't saying that in the 1 cent case you were looking at it from the perspective of the child. I was saying that you're
Oh.
willing to. No, I was saying that you're willing to make comparisons that involve comparing not bringing anyone into existence to bringing someone into existence.
Yeah,
you think that they're equally choice. You think that they're from the standpoint of the child. There's nothing.
No. Last part's wrong. There's never a point where I made that comparison. I didn't make it.
You will not find the end of the sentence objectionable if you didn't cut me off in the middle of the sentence. So the end of the sentence is from the standpoint of the child. There's nothing to compare between the two of them, and so there's nothing that affects the choice-worthiness of either action relating to the standpoint of the child, and so it's just why pay 1 cent.
Yeah, there's nothing to compare from the standpoint of the child, right? There's something to compare from your standpoint, right? That they have but no, I don't think that there's anything to compare from the standpoint to the child in the 1 penny case. I think it's. I mean, I agree. It's super it would be super counterintuitive to say that that you should forego having a child so somebody else could have 1 penny of benefit. But I think you can explain that without saying that, like, a non-existent, like the non-existent child has some moral status that I'm denied that they have.
I haven't yet gotten to the arguments for why the non-existent child has. So if we're comparing not having a child to having a child who lives 40 years, you think that we should be indifferent between those two? That we have no reason from the standpoint of the child to choose either one of them, because it's like they asking about impossible people or something. It's like, they're just not a thing that exists, so we don't have a reason to take their interest into account.
Yeah, I think I think that if I'm going to be scrupulously honest about this, I think my intuitions are muddier about that case than the other case. And I mean, I conceded that earlier. I would have to I would have to think more about it. I think that the principle that that sounds so intuitive when you're thinking about, like, what's wrong with, like, Don Marquis on abortion and stuff like that. The principle that sounds so intuitive that merely possible people that don't have any moral status, that there's no sort of that they can't be worse off by not existing, right? That principle that sounds so plausible there, I think, is challenged to a certain extent by this. Whether I think, in light of the negative case, right, the child who's dying at 40, whether that consideration of the case would actually drive me to say, like, yeah, I guess I'm just wrong.
No, sorry. The point wasn't the child that dies at 40. So we can actually, let's make the first case. The child lives to be a healthy 80 years old.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And so you think that if you're going to have a child who will live to be 80 years old, you have no reason to or not to do that relative to not having a child.
Well, you have no reason that's about the child, and I don't think
Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
I don't think anybody.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, you
just
might
to be
have
clear,
tons of other reasons, but that's not one of them. Yeah.
Right now we're holding all else equal.
Yeah.
So we're just, when I make a statement like this, I'm just referring to from the standpoint based on the interest of the child. And you also hold that if you're deciding between not having a child and having a child who will live to 100, then you have no reason to choose one over the other.
Not from the perspective of the child.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you accept
but it absolutely does not follow from that. There's no transitivity argument.
It does.
There
It does.
It doesn't, because you could say, like, we actually can compare a scenario where there's an existing person who's living one kind of life with a scenario where there's an existing person who's living another kind of life. There you can meaningfully make a comparison. What the principle, under consideration that, I've admitted to some ambivalence about, but like the principle under consideration, what it would say is that what you can't do is meaningfully compare either one of those to there simply not being a child from the perspective of the welfare of the child, because the claim would be that that neither of those possible people, right, is better off than a version of themselves that doesn't exist, because there just is no version of themselves that doesn't exist to be better or worse off. That's the claim. So there's no transitivity argument against this.
Well, you claim that you can't compare them, but you're willing to compare them in the limited sense that you think that when deciding from the standpoint of the child, that they're equally good and that it's a coin flip. If two things, if you have no reason to choose A over the other,
I'm really importantly not saying that. What you just said is really importantly different from what I said. That they have that saying that you can't compare them is not the same as saying they're equally good. Equally good is what if the possible outcomes of a comparison.
That's not my
claim is that you can't compare them.
But you have compared them in that you've said.
No, I haven't.
You've said that if we're deciding between doing one or the other, then we should be indifferent between the two of them. That's a comparison, claiming that we should be indifferent.
It's not a comparison of how good, like, it's not a
comparison of how choice-worthy the state of affairs brought about.
It's absolutely not, right? It's because it's a denial that there is a state of affairs to compare in the first place. So it's true. It's true that if you compare them and you say the two states of affairs are equally good, then it would follow that you have no reason to prefer one or the other. But it doesn't work the other way around. It doesn't follow from the fact that you think there's no reason to do one in the way or the other, that you think the two states of affairs are equally good. An alternative reason to think you have no reason one way or the other is that you think there just is no point of comparison. There's nothing that the first state of affairs can be compared to. So it's
the second one. The second one is a state of affairs. It may not be a state of, so we may say that the child isn't a feature of the situation in a meaningful sense in the second situation, but obviously there is a state of affairs in which you didn't have the child.
Yeah, and you can compare those two states of affairs from the perspective of the people who exist in the different states of affairs, right? But there is no state of affairs involving the child that's worse from the perspective of the child, or better, or exactly the same from the perspective of the child, because there just is no state of affairs from the perspective of the child to compare to either one.
Okay, so do you accept that if A and B are equally choice-worthy, and B and C are equally choice-worthy, then A and C are equally choice-worthy?
I think there's an equivocation there about equally choice-worthy. I think that because we're equating, you have no reason to choose one or the other, but it doesn't actually follow from you have no reason to choose between A and B, and you have no reason to choose between B and C, that you have no reason to choose between A and C, because that would only follow if the reason you had no reason to choose between A and B is that they were equally good, and the reason you had no reason to choose between B and C is that they're equally good. It could just be that you have no reason to choose from the perspective that you've stipulated, because there just is no basis of comparison from that perspective. But that doesn't mean that there's no basis of comparison between A and C.
Okay, are your do you accept that morality has to be complete? So it has to be able to evaluate, to exhaustively compare if we're deciding between A and B, that there has to be a fact of the matter about whether we should do A or B, or we should be indifferent between A and B.
Okay. Well, I don't accept that, but also I think that I don't think that there's anything about, there's any guarantee that that's always going to be the case. But I think even if I did accept it, you can still say that some questions are just kind of malformed, right? You say that if you say, like, if the question is from the perspective of the interests of the child,
well,
is A or B better?
That isn't the question. The question
it sounded like the question earlier.
No, well, so we have to be precise here. So the question is, if you hold all else constant, so the impact on everyone else constant, then do you have a moral reason to? And I think maybe there was a way that the question was phrased earlier, in which case I was being imprecise. But so if we hold everything, how well everybody else's life goes constant, and then we're deciding merely, and then given that everyone else is held constant, no one else will be affected. Now we're deciding whether or not we should have a child with an awesome life or have no child. And so,
well, you could have no moral reason holding all of those things constant to prefer one or the other without that being, like for both A and B and C, because B doesn't introduce something that would be the basis of a moral reason to hold one of them better than the other, but think that the difference between A and C does involve something that's the basis
now you're just denying. Now that's just a denial of transitivity.
No, it's not. It's not at all.
If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals.
But I'm not saying A equals. But I'm not saying A equals B. That's why it's not a denial of transitivity. I'm not saying A equals B. I'm saying that that if we're interested in the perspective of the child, then there just is no B.
You are at no. So what A is the act of creating a child with an awesome life. B is the act of not creating a child. So A and B are equally worthwhile on your view. You have no reason to choose one over the other.
They have so A and B are, you have no reason to choose one or the other, because a reason to choose would have to involve somebody who exists in one or the other scenario being worse off.
So do you now accept that A equals B?
I think A equals B is a really misleading way to put that. They have a because
your reasons
there's
for
could it be that there's I don't think that when we say for uses of A equals B, they're tied to plausible transitivity, plausible transitivity principles. I don't think that that there being no morally relevant difference between A and B and C. I don't think that could be the basis of a morally plausible transitivity principle, because I think that it can clearly be the case in this case that there is a morally relevant difference between A and C, that we can compare the welfare of somebody in A to the welfare of somebody in C, but there is no welfare of somebody in B that we can compare to either one to bring the whole thing off the ground. I mean, if you want to call that a denial of transitivity, I guess that's fine. But I'd say that it's a denial of something you could call a transitivity principle. I don't think it's usually what people mean, but I think that they have the point is this particular transitivity principle, I think 10 seconds of reflection on cases like this should show that it's just not a plausible transitivity principle.
Well, so now we can talk about the arguments for transitivity, which apply perfectly adequately to this transitivity model, to use your phrasing. So are you familiar with the money pump argument?
No, what's the money pump argument?
So let's say that you have this is easier to show with preferring A to B and B to C and C to A, and then having them be equal. But so let's say you prefer A to B, B to C, but you prefer C to A. Well,
Mhm.
you'd be, if you prefer A to B, then if you start with B, you'd be willing to pay 1 penny in order to get A, because you prefer A to B. You'd be
Mhm.
willing to pay 1 penny to get C, 1 penny to get B. And so now you've paid 3 cents and you're back where you started. And so
Mhm.
just from intransitive preferences, you can make a series of deals in which you take all the money of
Mhm.
the people with intransitive preferences, which makes them good to have as friends, but not good, or good to have as deal partners,
Mhm.
because you can take all their money, but not very good as a rational, as a rational way of reasoning about things.
Mhm.
So I guess so.
So what's the money pump equivalent here that you
Well,
wouldn't
so the
that
money
you
pump
think?
equivalent here. So
Yeah.
let's say that you start with making the
Yeah.
decision to not have to have a child with. So the three things are having a child with a decent life, having no child, and having a child with an awesome life. Okay, so
Mhm.
you start deciding that you're going to have a child with um, with a decent life. Okay.
Mhm.
And so someone says, here, I'll give you 1 penny in order to not have a child. And you say, okay, I won't have a child. Then they say, okay, I'll offer you, or wait, sorry, I messed up the setup. Sorry. So
Okay.
you're originally going to have a child with an awesome life.
Mhm.
And they say, okay, instead of having a child with the awesome life, I'll pay
Mhm.
you 1 penny to have no child. So you say, okay,
Mhm.
I'll take that deal.
Mhm.
Okay, so now you're going to have no child. Then they
Mhm.
say, I'll offer you 1 penny to have a child with a decent life. And you say,
Mhm.
okay, that's fine. I'll have a child with a decent life. That's just as
Mhm.
choice worthy as having a child with an awesome life. And then they
Mhm.
say, if you give me 10 cents, we'll switch you from having a child with a decent life, or
Mhm.
sorry, from having a child with an awesome life, or no, sorry, from having a child with a decent life to having a child with an awesome life. And so
Okay.
you want to take that deal because you value it in more than 10 cents. Now you're back where you started and you're down 8 cents. So we can keep running through this.
I guess I'm not I okay. I feel like I missed something there somewhere, but I have a like that. So if you don't value the difference between two things, you should be willing to make a decision between them on the basis of a trivial amount of money, or whatever. Like, you should be willing to be paid, for the difference, which and then, so because you'd be willing to be paid for the difference in both cases, there's some scenario where you'd end up losing some money. Is
Well, no,
that the shape of the argument?
you'd actually lose all of your money, and it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be money. So we can just have infliction of 1 units of suffering, and then we get from your preferences just running in
Uh-huh.
a loop where you keep being willing to move to a state of affairs where you're back where you started, but there's more suffering in the world, and yet
Hmm.
that's not the ideal view of preferences. So just tell me where you go wrong, where you reject the deal. Okay,
I don't
so
know. I mean, I don't know that I mean, the claim that they have that if you have, I mean, so I'm trying to imagine here. So you've got, so
we're
you
now
don't,
we're now
so
seeing
you're
evidence.
imagining a psychologically impossible human being whose life would be unaffected by having a child, and they know this in advance. Um, and
Well,
then you're
it's metaphysically possible. It's just
Yeah, that's why I said psychological.
unlikely.
No, it's psychologically impossible is what it is.
Okay,
That
sure.
humans aren't like that, right? So this psychologically impossible person, should they be willing to make this decision on the basis of payment, or some other sort of, some other sort of like change to their welfare? Not that, I
We're
don't know.
saying
I don't. I mean, like, that itself seems like a big step, and I'm not sure what to think about it. I mean, I think that I mean, certainly it seems like you should. It seems like you, again. I mean, like, we're getting further and further from psychologically possible human beings. Because I think most people would. You
We're
know,
no further than we were when we started
no,
the
we are
question.
right. You know,
So I,
we've moved another step because we're considering somebody who's making such a decision, who doesn't, you know, who doesn't value making such a decision like on their own, like, you know, that like most people would think of that as cheapening the decision. Um, I don't
the
know.
joke that I feel I have to make here is now
Yeah.
we're seeing that if socialists really lived their principles, they give away all their money.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I don't know what I think about I don't know what I think about the principle being invoked in
Well, so let's just
the money pump argument. I
tell
will
me where
note.
you tell me where you get off the money pump carousel. Okay,
Oh,
so
I don't know that I get on, right? Because like I don't know that I mean the sort of principle that if you have that
to tell me which of these deals you would not take.
if you're otherwise indifferent between two outcomes, then you sort of therefore rationally have to be willing to accept payment to decide one way or the other. I mean, maybe that's right, but I mean, it doesn't seem like, oh, obviously that's right. We all assume
Okay,
that, so let's just accept that and
well,
proceed from there. I mean,
so
maybe it
then
is, maybe it's not.
just tell me where you
I mean, I
the
just told
carousel.
you, right?
Okay. Well, no. Well, so we start with
I just told you that like here's this big thing that we have to assume to get on, and I'm not sure whether even
no.
that's true.
Well, no. So just let's assume that you start with one state of affairs, and now let's ask which deal you would take. Okay. So you
Mhm.
start where you've decided you're going to have a child with an awesome life. Okay. And someone goes to you and says, and you know you're this implausible psychological human where you won't actually
Mhm.
care, your life won't be affected, etc. Okay. And someone says, I'll offer you 1 penny not to have a child.
Mhm. Yeah. So the
Do you
claim
take the
that
deal?
I don't know. I have I don't think it's obvious that you take the deal. I think that the principle, like, certainly, I don't think it's obvious that it's like you have some sort of rational obligation to take the deal.
Well, earlier you
No,
said
I didn't.
that much like around 20 minutes ago in the
Okay.
conversation, what you said is that if you had it be the case that you could either have a child, have no child, or a child with an awesome life, given that you think that you should be indifferent between doing those two things, then if someone
Well,
offered you 1 penny to
okay.
do one over the other, then you would take the one
No, I
that
didn't.
gave
I
you
absolutely did not say that 20 minutes ago. I
what?
said
Okay, I have a distinct
I
people. We can
roll back the tape, people.
yeah, we can
I
roll
absolutely
back the
did not
tape.
say it. What I said is that is that any reason that you have to do that or not do that has nothing to do with the interest of the child. That's a very different claim from saying that I would in fact take the penny to do that.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like okay, actually there are a few places. So one question.
I will also just note that we're already over the amount of time that we were originally talking about this conversation happening, and we've spent the
Oh,
entire
sorry.
time on this sort of you know we've spent the entire time on arguments for the repugnant conclusion. I'm happy to stay for another half hour or so, but I do just want to sort of I did just want to kind of step in and note that in case you wanted to take things in a different direction at this point.
Yeah. So okay. I mean, so what I realized that I just totally forgot to show how it follows from those
Okay,
axioms
sure.
that we should accept
Yep.
repugnant conclusion. So the
Okay.
basic
Yep.
idea. Yeah. So I'll just explain that very quickly. So the basic
Mhm.
idea is so we start with the world where you have the one person who will live a minimally the one person who will live a decent life.
Mhm.
Or wait, no. What am I saying? Sorry. You start with world A has 10 billion people who will live an
Mhm.
awesome life. Okay. Then world A plus has 10 billion people who live an awesome life, and their life actually becomes slightly more awesome. So you add
Mhm.
more, you make their utility higher, and then you
Mhm.
add 100 quadrillion people with slightly positive utility.
Mhm.
With very barely worth while lives. So that's better than the first world, as per the first principle,
Mhm. Mhm.
because you made everyone's life better and then added new people with positive lives. And then you compare that to world Z, where everyone's life is, you have 100 quadrillion people, everyone's life is barely worth living. And the barely worth living lives in this world are, let's say, twice as good as the very barely worthwhile lives in the other world. Well, this
Mhm.
world now has a higher average utility, total utility, and more equal distribution of utility than the other one. And so then by transitivity, because Z is better than A plus, and A plus is better than A, therefore Z would be better than A, which is just the repugnant conclusion.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I mean, I have much more to say about the repugnant conclusion, but let's talk about your curious reluctance to kill people and harvest their organs.
Yeah,
Uh,
me and 99.9999999% not only of the human race, but of utilitarians, because most utilitarians are very embarrassed by this consequence of utilitarian and contort themselves into knots to try to avoid it.
yeah, and those are beta utilitarians. So no, but I mean, just to
Sure,
promissory note,
sure,
in the real world, one should not kill people and harvest their organs. It is
sure,
clearly
sure.
not the utilitarian thing to do. I mean, for one, just like the number of organs that you get for like most organs that are attempted to be given end up being rejected because they're like not. And so they're also
But if you
things
take all
however
of the
effective.
original
Yeah.
Judith Jarvis Thompson conditions that you're the most amazing organ surgeon who's ever been, and somehow you know that every single one of these organs is going to be accepted, and you accept all those implausibilities, then you think that you should do it.
Yeah.
And maybe we also need to add some other conditions to avoid possible utility wars.
Right.
Yeah.
And so now the question is, let's see, which of my reasons for hard
Okay. Yeah.
So do you accept that so let's say that you're a benevolent third party observer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you accept that a benevolent third party observer should hope for a state of affairs in which things go best? If they're just choosing between two worlds, they should hope for the better world.
All else being equal, or period?
Period.
Period. No, of course not.
Okay, so a benevolent third party observer should sometimes hope for things go for a worse world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you give me a case in which you think
organ harvested? I mean, that seems like one of the most intuitively clear cases you could ever possibly.
So you accept that the world would be better if you killed people and harvested their organs?
Yeah, that's fine. They have a we're not.
But you're opposed.
I don't think all moral comparisons are comparisons of states of affairs. And if you don't believe that all moral comparisons are comparisons of states of affairs, if you think other things can have moral valence besides states of affairs, then either you think there's some sort of weird guarantee that the sort of preferability of a state of affairs is always going to trump those other moral considerations, or you think sometimes a benevolent third party observer should prefer the worst state of affairs because the decision that would bring about the better one is so morally bad that that would trump it.
Okay, so you accept that sometimes. So now let's say that we have a second benevolent third party observer, and they're deciding whether to put the first benevolent third party observer. Well, actually, no. So what I mean by that, like, it seems like what I mean by better world is just a world that, from an impartial point of view, that we should prefer, that we have the most reason to care about.
Well, I mean, if that's all you mean, then my answer would be.
I'd be curious what you mean by better world, if not that.
Yeah, I think that you could have an outcome. Like, some outcomes are more desirable than others, but they have but that doesn't necessarily mean that that bringing about the better outcome is always morally preferable. I mean, I think if you assume that it is, you're just kind of you're just kind of sneaking in the assumption of consequentialism, and I would just say, well, why should I accept that?
Well, I don't think it's sneaking in the assumption of consequentialism. It's an argument for consequentialism, which is
if so, it's a profoundly question-begging argument from consequentialism.
Well, I don't think so. Well, I haven't
because you're already assuming consequentialism. What consequentialism is just the view that the better that bringing about the better outcome is always what should be morally preferred. If you're assuming that at the beginning of your argument, then it can't be an argument for that.
Well, no, I don't think that consequentialism is the view that the best outcome is the one that should be morally preferred. I think it's the view that the best outcome is the one that should be morally brought about by an agent. But there's a difference between but it could be the case that what the agent has most reason to do and what another person has most reason to hope that they do end up coming apart.
It could be, although so far I haven't heard any reason to think that that would be the case.
So what do you mean? What do you mean by better world, if not the world that a third party observer has more reason to want to be the world?
Yeah, again, I think if the question is just what kind of world, right, should the third party observer want, then they have a that, like, all else being equal, should they want this world to be brought about, sure, if it's a better state of affairs, then all else being equal, they have a reason to want it. But
we're not talking about all else equal.
Okay, but yeah, should they have all things considered? Should they always want the better world to be brought about? Not necessarily. If the only way to If the only way to bring about the better
The
world.
question that I asked was, what do you mean? So what I mean by a better world is just a world, like it seems like a world is better if and only if it is a world that a impartial, benevolent third party would prefer to a different world. And so if that's not what you mean, then I don't know what you mean by a better world.
Well, I guess maybe I'm unclear on the question, because I think that a impartial, benevolent, third party would not want you to do things that are morally wrong. Sometimes morally wrong things might still lead to a better state of affairs, but that's but I mean, we want to separate out those questions.
So then once again, the question is, what do you mean by a better third party, or by a better world?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about a better world, that sounds like an evaluation of the state of affairs, not an evaluation of the morality of whatever action it takes to bring about that state of affairs. I mean, if you're somehow incorporated, your evaluation of the morality of the action, that just seems like a strange and fairly misleading way of using the phrase "a better world."
Okay, so you can object to my characterization as strange and misleading, but so I'm just asking you, what do you mean by better world? Because when I mean by better world,
well, I've said it a couple times. I'll happy to say it again. I think that I think that you could have like the better outcome. We're comparing the way the world is at T2 with the way the world is at T1, and say if we're not thinking about what you'd have to do to bring it about or anything like that, we're just thinking about the total way the world is at the 2 points, then it seems very plausible to me that you would sometimes that would sometimes be like that there's a difference between an outcome being better or worse and the action of bringing about that outcome being better or worse, right? If you could just sort of magically, without having to do anything bad to bring it about, right? If you could just sort of magically will it into existence that you have one world better than the other. I don't know. I guess I'm confused about what you're I think that they have that all else being equal, it's certainly better to have worlds where fewer people are suffering or whatnot. But I mean, I think that a benevolent, impartial observer would still not want people to violate anybody's rights to bring about a world with less suffering.
Okay, I get the sense that you're under the view that you've answered my question, but I'm not under the view that because to me what it seems like
if so, the question is very unclear to me.
Well, what you've said, you've described one thing that better states of affairs are not, which is what a third party observer. But I mean, I guess maybe this is just different. Do you just take better worlds to be like a primitive concept?
Maybe, I don't know. I mean,
it seems.
I mean, I don't know that I have a complete definition in my back pocket of what makes a world better or worse than another world. I mean, I think that there are certain things that make worlds better or worse than others that we can state. Do I have do I have a complete list of everything that would make a world better or worse? I think that would be a pretty arrogant thing to claim. I've figured all that out.
I'm not asking for a complete list. I'm just asking what you mean by a better world.
Yeah, well, okay, but I wouldn't even claim to have necessary and sufficient conditions. I think it's a really complicated question. I think that we can talk about certain things that plausibly make the world better or worse, but I don't think that means that I have a complete definition to offer of what makes something a better or worse world. I mean, that'd be a weird thing to just assume that everybody's carried around.
Okay, well, sure. So I mean, one thing is, it does seem like there's an intuitive notion, at the very least, that you would have to reject, that what we should want to happen is what the best things are for happening. Wait,
what we should want to happen?
That was not a sentence.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. What we should want to happen, we should want for the best things to happen. If choosing between, if we're just asking one thing is better than another thing, and we're asking which one we should hope for, it seems like an almost analytic truth that we should hope for the better thing.
that we should hope for the
And that's
better thing to happen. I don't think that's
right.
an analytic truth. I don't even think it's true that they have unless it's all else being equal. I don't think it's true.
Well, okay, so but surely you agree that it at least has some prima facie plausibility.
Yeah, I think it has some prima facie plausibility that's captured by saying all else being equal, we should hope for the better outcome. But like, I think that's defeasible. Like that. I think that is enough to capture what's prima facie plausible about it. I think that but I think if you go beyond that to say that we should just absolutely always hope for the better outcome, then you're just denying the possibility that sometimes a wrong action could bring about a better outcome, and I don't see any reason to deny that a priori.
Sure. Okay. So so in terms of the notion of rights, which seems to be the reason you say that people have these rights and you shouldn't. I think these strange entities, which apparently make it so that you shouldn't kill them and harvest their organs. So I think that there are a variety of very forceful objections to the notion of rights. One of which I'll present.
Sure.
There's a way of making this be specified to apply to the organ harvesting case, but this actually just ends up making the thought experiment way more complicated, and it's already a pretty confusing thought experiment. So we'll just apply the simple general case. So so let's imagine that we have a very large series of rings of moral people. Okay, so we stipulate just everyone in the circle. They're all saints. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
So the innermost circle has one person. The second innermost circle has 5 people. Third innermost has 25, etc. And each person is paired off with 5 people in the circle outside of them. So the first guy is paired off with all 5 people in circle 2. Next people are the 5 people in circle 2. Each of them are paired off with 5 people in circle 3, etc. So now each person is given 2 options. Option 1 is kill one person. And option 2 is give the 5 people in the circle outside of you corresponding to you the same options that you were just given. So which do you think? Which should be taken?
Sorry, that was really convoluted. Give that to me one more time. What are your options?
Yeah. So you have the option one is
okay. Yep.
Option 1 is kill one person, and then they'll have to go out and kill a person.
Sorry, the thing that you were sort of saying very softly, I think was probably going to be really important. So what was it again?
Well, then they have to go out. So the first option is killing a person, and so they would have to go out and kill a person. Yeah.
Okay.
And option 2 is give the 5 people who you're paired with, give them the same options that you were given.
Which are. Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry. So let me just make sure I have the question right. So the question is. So for each person, right, that they have that in the ring with fewer people, the 2 options you have are killing one person in your ring or in the outside, in the more populous ring,
just
or anybody.
Yeah, you're just killing some other random.
Okay, so you're just picking somebody at random to kill them. That's one option, and then the second option is you're giving 5 people the option of either killing one person or passing
the buck
or passing it on, right?
However, the people, so there are 100 circles. The people in the 100th circle, they don't have 2 options. They only have, given that there's no one outside their circle, they can't choose option 2. So if it gets to the 100th circle, then they'll all have to kill someone. In which case, 5 to the power of 99 people will end up being killed. Which seems like unfortunate.
Yeah.
So the question is, so let's say you're the person in the first circle. Which action should you take? Or which action should the perfectly moral person in the first circle take?
Yeah. So both options are completely morally unacceptable. So it's a moral tragedy, and there's no answer.
Okay, but you have to take one.
No, but I don't actually.
You do.
Try to make me. I dare you.
Okay, so
no, it's
a moral experiment.
It's a moral tragedy. It's unanswerable.
Okay, if you don't do either, look, Ben, these are the type of situations that arise frequently in our daily lives and that we need ethics to solve. But wait, so you're just refusing to answer the thought experiment? I mean, my
answer to the thought experiment is that it would be wrong. It It'd be wrong to do either one.
Well, we can build in the thought experiment a third feature that makes it so that you have to answer it. So if you don't answer it, infinite puppies will be tortured from now till the end of time.
Well, that's a really bad God, but that doesn't make it right for me to do it.
Okay, but so in this thought experiment, what should you do?
There's no answer. All options are really wrong.
Inaction but you have to pick one. Otherwise, the infinite puppies will be tortured. Wait, okay, do you understand how silly it would be when confronted with a trolley problem, if your answer was, these are all bad answers, I refuse to give a view? And I think that this actually serves as if you can play that game where you say, they're all bad answers, I'm not going to answer the question. I'll just play that game with the argument harvesting case. So I'll say, they're all bad options, killing a person is...
Well, I would say if you said that about the Oregon case, then you've made considerable moral progress.
Well, okay, but I mean, to me, that would just be a cop-out. Not answering the question is not virtue.
Yeah, I don't.
The problem. Answering the question is what the if you have a beta utilitarian.
I mean, let me try to do better. I think that they have a. I think that, I get what the question is doing. I think it's plausible that they have if you were. I actually don't rule out the possibility. I don't think it's necessarily the right answer to the trolley problem or the organ donor case, because in those cases, there might be very good reasons to answer in a definite way. But I don't rule out the possibility in general that there could just be moral tragedies where there's no good answer. I don't think that's the sort of thing that we should rule out a priori. Now, that said, is that the right answer to this case? Maybe not. Maybe that in this case.
Well, no. So there being no good answer doesn't mean there's no least bad answer.
Mm-hmm.
And so just imagine that you are actually in this situation. Mm-hmm. What do you think a person should do? Because they if they don't act, then infinite puppies will be tortured. Mm-hmm. And that would be really sad.
Yeah. So look, let's assume that let's assume that you do. We're taking the possibility of a moral tragedy where all answers are indefensible off the table, and so we have to answer. It could very well be that in this case they have let's say anything. We can make it a much simpler example that that if you don't kill this one puppy, infinite puppies will be tortured or something like that, right? That they have let's say that what the least morally bad possibility
you're now changing the hypothetical.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Let's say that in this case, right, in your original case, right, the least bad option is to kill somebody. So the morally preferable thing to do is to kill somebody. Is that a reason to think that you don't have rights, or is it just a reason?
Well, I'm not done with the argument, right? So the argument is okay. So we accept that you should take option one. So now there's this very plausible principle, which is that giving a perfectly moral person extra options that they don't have to take, assuming they won't be bothered by the extra options or anything, can't be a bad thing. Given that if the extra option is bad, then they won't take the option. And if the extra option is good, then they will take the option. So it's at the very least not bad.
It's at the very least not bad to give people extra options.
To give people who will always make the correct choice, to give them extra option.
Okay.
You accept that. That seems like.
Again, I think it's so abstract that I deny that anybody ever could have a strong intuition about it, but I think it sounds somewhat plausible.
Okay. So if we accept that, but you also accept that you shouldn't kill one person to prevent 5 killings, right?
Well, the comparison there isn't to prevent 5 killings; it's to prevent 5 people from dying, and that's a really important distinction.
I'm aware, but I'm asking you about killing one person to prevent 5 killings.
To prevent 5 killings, probably not. To prevent the to prevent the torture of infinite puppies, maybe so. Maybe in that case, there's a...
Well, no, the torture of infinite puppies, we can now set that aside. That was just an ultimatum to get you to answer the question.
Okay.
Because the point was just that if you refuse, if you just say I won't answer, I will refuse, then infinite, so obviously just not doing anything in thought experiments. Okay, but
yeah, that's okay. That's a good point. So maybe the right answer is you should flip a coin to save the puppies.
Okay, so you think that. Okay, but so you think that you should take, but you said that you think you should take option one, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think if
you should kill the one person.
I think if you're forced to choose between two immoral actions, then the one that's less morally bad. I think it's at least somewhat plausible that's the one you should pick. I don't think that's as obvious as things like, intuitions about cases like don't push the guy into the tracks, but I think it's at least somewhat plausible. So let's roll with it and see where we go.
Well, okay. So, if you just remember that the conclusion is, so if you take option two, if you think that a person should take option two, then that would mean that the 5 people in the outer circle should also take option two, and the 5 people in the outer circle of them should also take option two. Should mean that the end result of your action, the predictable consequence, is rather than you killing one person, 5 to the power of 99 people being killed. And I think, most people think that, you shouldn't kill one person to save 5. You should kill one person to save the world. And this is actually saving considerably more people than there are in the world. And so it's, unless you're the most radical type of deontologist, you would think we should take option one. But here's the problem with option one. So if you say we should take option one, so you've accepted, so you think that you shouldn't kill one person to prevent 5 killings. But you should kill one person to prevent a perfectly moral person from having either the option of doing a killing or of passing the buck. But you've also accepted, or sort of somewhat tentatively, the principle that giving a perfectly moral person extra options can't make things worse, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, I have no idea whether that's true or not, but let's accept it for the sake of argument.
Right. So if you shouldn't kill one person to prevent 5 killings, let's say the killings would be taken out by perfectly moral people who have to do the killings. Presumably, you still shouldn't kill one person to prevent the 5 killings in that case.
So now we've changed it to a case where there's no, you're not continuing to pass the buck between the circles. You're just talking about a one-off.
Well, we're currently describing different hypothetical where you're
I was just wanting to make sure I was tracking which hypothetical we're in right now.
Yeah.
So right now we're in a hypothetical where there are no other rigs. It's just a one done thing that either you kill this one person or
5 perfectly mortal people kill one person.
Okay. Yeah.
And we can rig some case in which the perfectly mortal people are killing someone because they falsely believe that they should kill a person. Like they think that killing the person will save the world, but it actually won't or something. The details there don't matter. So you think that you shouldn't kill one person to prevent 5 perfectly mortal people from carrying out.
Yeah, I mean, look, like the last 100 hypotheticals, these are all the kinds of things that I doubt anybody has very clear intuitions on or could have very clear intuitions on. But sure, let's say yes.
I mean, this is just a slightly rejiggered case of killing one person to prevent 5 killings. So you think you shouldn't kill one person to prevent 5 killings. You think that to prevent 5 perfectly moral people from each killing one person. But you should kill one person to prevent 5 perfectly moral people from either having the option to kill one person or to pass the buck. But you've also accepted that giving them extra options can't make things worse. And so your judgment about the 2 cases can't be, if we accept that principle, can't be such that...
So I think that might demonstrate that principle, on which, again, I don't have a strong intuition. I don't think anybody has a strong intuition. It's too abstract for moral intuition to really touch it one way or the other. But they have that principle that extra options can't make things worse. I think that if we have to, if something has to go here, that's a really good option, right? Because it's because that's something that's that doesn't so that again, it's so any possible intuitive reaction anybody might imagine they're having to that is just so going to be so weak,
Well,
right?
no,
It's
well, so
like who cares whether you accept that or not, right? They have a like it's not a that the but like saying if the consequence of thinking that giving perfectly moral people extra options can't make things worse, can't ever make things worse. Not just like all else being equal, it can't make things worse, but it can't ever in any scenario
well,
make
no,
things.
no. Well, can't. We're holding all else equal. So obviously, if you give them extra options, but also make it so that, but also like torture a puppy as a result of like part of giving them extra options is torturing a puppy. Like obviously,
Uh,
if all else is not being held equal, then the principle is insane and no one should accept it.
no, but I mean, but the point is that they have that like this this scenario right about the rings of people does seem like a case um, in which giving perfectly moral people extra options would actually make things way worse, right? Because especially given the plausible assumption that perfectly moral people would be reluctant to kill someone, they then eventually you're getting to the point where the perfectly moral people who somehow have no other choice are killing whatever that incredibly large number of people was. Then like it seems like, yeah, for sure, giving perfectly moral people extra options, you have demonstrated the falsity of that principle. That because this is a case where giving perfectly moral people other options makes things unfathomably worse.
Well, so what we'll see is that um, I think that we have lots of other reasons to reject rights, but this principle. So the given that the perfect person, they'll only take the worst op. So the option, I think there was a. So I mean, I think just a brief thing that's worth noting
Mm.
that I think may represent part of the core of our disagreement. Though I think
Mm-hmm.
I mean I think upon reflection, people will become utilitarians. I think if they can weigh up the entire cumulative case and all the considerations. But I think that I'm much more willing to privilege the types of intuitions
Yes,
like transitivity that are
I
more
think
sort of
I think that
abstract in
is
nature
I think
and
that is
more.
absolutely the core methodological difference between us. I think that human beings have strong and real moral intuitions about cases. I think that the more abstract the principle gets, I think the less intuitions about it are worse. I think this is how people end up becoming deontic libertarians. That you can sort of lay out sort of general deontic libertarian principles that sound sort of plausible if you're just considering them in the abstract, and then if you sort of hold on
Well,
to those and you grind through all of the bullets you have to bite in cases, then you can pat yourself on the back for being very rational.
well, but
But
the thing is, I think that
it's a terrible methodology because you're ignoring your strongest moral intuitions.
well, so if we're gonna be hurling invective at each other, like accusing the other ones of being like, radical deontological libertarians. Well, I mean, I think that your view is sort of like those who deny transitivity. They see that if they accept transitivity, they have to have a few unintuitive results, and so then they just end up sort of denying the almost self-evident principle that if something's better than something else, which is better than a third thing, it seems to almost just fall out of what we mean by better than.
Yeah,
And
but notice
sort of
that's
in the
not the
first place.
transitivity principle we were talking about earlier, right? That's importantly different from that transitivity principle, which is that if there's no reason to morally prefer,
It
uh,
falls that second one falls out of
I don't think it
the one
does.
I just gave. It falls out of the first one, but we spent enough time talking
I
about
think I think you could coherently accept one of those principles and deny the other.
but also well, okay, but remember, I wasn't saying that you did reject transitivity. I was just because much like you weren't saying that I was in fact a
Oh, I see.
deontological
I see. I see.
libertarian. You're just
I see.
saying I was like a deontological
Yeah, but I
libertarian.
mean, being compared to people who reject some principle about transitivity doesn't really bother me very much because I don't. I think that's pretty like whether some like big claim about moral transitivity is true or not is the kind of thing that's such a like that's such a higher order thing, and that like to come out of like moral reflection that like that I just don't think that should weigh very hard, right? I think
Okay,
that the
I think maybe your accusation has of like there's a more plausible story to be told about how I'm like some clearly very confused people than how you're like some clearly very confused.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I wouldn't even.
But we can, let's go back to describing the case. So, so if the option is better than the current options that are already had, then they would have no reason to take it, right? So if the new option that you give to the perfectly moral person, if it's a good option, then they'll take the good option. And it's no doubt good to give a person a good option that they'll take. But if it's a bad option, they won't take it, given that they only choose correctly. And so making it so that either there's no change in the option that someone takes, or they take a good action, is if they're if it sorry, I got distracted from them. If it is the case that the act that you'll either make it so that they take a new good option that they have, or that they'll take, or that there will be no change in something. Seems like making it so that someone makes a new correct choice that's better than their current slate of choices, or things don't change. I mean, it just seems like given that those are the only two options.
You get distracted by the chat.
Yeah. By the questions about transitivity. Yeah. So those are the only two options.
I mean, I think, I get it, right? I mean, I get what you're saying. I think at the point, I realize it might have sounded, since I'm describing a position that neither of us like, it might sound insulting. But my intention in bringing up the comparison about libertarianism is that it's an illustration of why I think that the preferring sort of intuitions about extremely abstract moral principles to intuitions about cases, I think is a methodology that can really lead people astray, right? I think that now whether that's going on here or not, of course, we could disagree about, but I think that I'm agreeing with you, right? I'm agreeing with you that like there is like a big part of the reason we're coming to different conclusions is that we are disagreeing about which kinds of intuitions should count for more.
Yeah, I mean, so the other thing is like, I think that, I've written an article called A Bayesian Analysis of When Utilitarianism Diverges from Our Intuitions, which I think is, pretty like stereotypical effective altruist-y title. But so the basic point is that, given that we know if we just look back at our moral intuitions throughout history, we know that at least some reasonable percentage of them have been wrong. I mean, lots of people have thought slavery was okay. Lots of people have currently think that factory farming is okay. People have, I mean, if you look at the attitude towards genocide prior to the 1930s, there was Neil Sinababu was talking about how just there's the original term for the guy who coined the term genocide, he was deciding upon it. He decided between the term genocide and like spoiling. So like the attitude towards genocide was so banal that it was given this like that the second choice for the name was like, it wasn't spoiling, it was something else. So just given that our moral intuitions, I think we have reason to expect some percentage of them to be wrong. Then the fact that some theory diverges from our intuitions in some cases, even strongly held intuitions, is not actually going to be evidence against the theory.
Well, it's going to be defeasible evidence against the theory.
Well, no, it's not even going to be defeasible evidence against the theory. So, because we would expect the correct moral theory to diverge from our intuitions in some cases. But I think that there are features of our moral there are facts about our moral intuitions wherein a theory could be evidence against it. So what we would expect for the correct moral theory is for there to be some cases that we can think of where it runs counter to our intuitions. But here's what we wouldn't expect. Well, for one, we wouldn't expect it here are things that we would expect about the correct moral theory when it diverges from our intuitions. One, I mean, I think we would have some reason, just given that, more theoretically virtuous theories are more likely to be true, we'd expect it to be sort of theoretically.
Yeah, I mean, this gets into the meta-ethical stuff that I was touching on at the very beginning, right? If you think that there's some sort of like, if you think that there's some sort of underlying moral reality that like where moral intuitions are maybe like an imperfect way of accessing, right? Then I think those kinds of simplicity considerations, have some weight. I don't know how much they have, but certainly some, right? That makes sense. But if you think that like there just is nothing but moral intuition that they have, that we're not describing some sort of underlying reality, like what we're doing, the only thing that we can be doing, right? This is that kind of human intuition I was talking about at the beginning, right? The only thing that we can be doing when we're reasoning about morality is trying to
I still think that
into
under that assumption, we would still prefer simpler theories for some sort of slightly complicated reasons that we definitely should not get into. They would take us pretty far astray. But
I mean, it could even be right that it turns out that on the right view we have that we should assign some weight maybe to simplicity. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I'd have that sounds like a much longer discussion, but they have a it could be. I mean, my initial impulse is just like, look, it's just a fact about us that we have moral feelings about a variety of different things, not just comparing the outcomes or states of affairs is one of them. Right, moral character is one of them. Individual, behavior is one of them. Sort of.
So if we sort of go hugely into the weeds on each of these points, this will never.
Yeah,
no
doubt. But can I just ask? I just want to get too far off, right? Like, is there some reason to think, right? If there are a certain number of past moral intuitions that we would now laudably reject, and I'm not sure that all those examples earlier were examples of moral intuitions exactly, but there were certainly examples of moral judgments, right? There are these various past moral judgments that we like laudably reject now. Do we have reason to think that moral judgments about extremely abstract principles are less likely to be wrong than about cases? And if so, what is it?
Well, so I don't. Okay, so there are a few points. So the first important point is what I was making. What wasn't I wasn't making the case that I was making wasn't for just one for privileging our intuitions. I was just sort of describing. Because we can go hugely into the weeds on these things. We have done with we barely scratched the surface.
I mean, the entire conversation's been in the weeds. That's which is fine. I mean, just but yeah.
Yeah, but I think that given that I see our moral intuitions as being sort of like these sensors. Let's say we get things right 95% of the time.
Yeah.
Well, given that there are a huge number of moral thought experiments, we would expect sensors that get things right all of the time to or get things right 95% of the time. We'd expect those to diverge from the correct moral judgment about 5% of the time. But so if we have a theory that perfectly matches our intuitions all the time, then there's a question of whether we're just what we've uncovered is the formula behind the sensor, or what we've uncovered is the actual correct thing. So now, but I think the important point is what are some things we would expect about the correct moral theory? Well, for one, I think we would expect it to be theoretically virtuous, but maybe we wouldn't. I think we would expect there to be plausible ways of deriving it from first principles, which now those first principles are certainly not the type of things that no one could reject. Obviously, anyone can reject anything, but it's at least like we would expect there to be plausible ways of reasoning to it.
Uh-huh.
I think we would expect it to generally be historically progressive and to get things right far ahead of their time, which I think is true of utilitarians. Bentham, for example, supported legalizing homosexuality in like the 1790s. John Stuart Mill was the second member of parliament to advocate women's suffrage. And the important, but I think the most crucial point is that when our intuitions end up diverging from the correct moral theory, we would expect that when we really analyze them, that there were surprisingly compelling reasons to reject our intuitions. So, because if we're making an error, then when we sort of really think about the principle behind, if we're making an error, then if we really sort of try to reach reflective equilibrium, we would expect it to be sort of hard. We would at least have lots of countervailing considerations across a lot of these cases. So what I've tried to show, and maybe I think this is possibly a good place to wrap up. I obviously have not gotten to, I mean, the problem is just the moral space is just too large to like be able to coherently just like dispute even a teeny sliver of it. So you can read my, writings on the subject. My many part series advocating for utilitarianism. But I think the broad point is that what I think we've seen is that the alleged counterexamples to utilitarianism, when we analyze them, it ends up being at least decently hard to maintain. I think that we showed that more. We were able to see that more so with the repugnant conclusion. That's only one of like 10 or so arguments.
Yeah, I mean, I will say the argument you gave me for the repugnant conclusion involved, I think, multiple premises that I just don't have any strong feelings about one way or the other, whether they're true. So I think, and I think in the, I think in the case of the other, the organ harvesting case, I think we got so deeply lost in the weeds of one particular argument for organ harvesting that we never really got to the sort of contrary moral intuitions. But I mean, I think that maybe the I think the interesting argument to be had is whether there's a morally significant difference between between killing and letting die, whether that's just status quo bias if you think so, whether the argument that's just status quo bias if you think so is question-beggingly consequentialist, all that stuff. But I mean, I guess I would just say that I'm not sure that I particularly agree, that I mean, I think it's certainly true that like sometimes moral intuitions conflict with other moral intuitions, and that if you're interested in trying to hammer them into a consistent picture, you have to reject some of them. That's true, right? No doubt about that, right? It's also true that that some moral judgments that people have had in the past differ from some moral judgments that we have now, and it's possible the reason has to do with with differences in moral intuitions with them. But so that like, are you going to? I mean, yeah, I think on any consistent moral theory, right, you're going to have to throw out some, right? I mean, I think the question is always going to be about whether which options to throw them out are more plausible than the other. On the claim that we should expect the right moral theory to have all those features that you just mentioned, I'm not sure if I think that's true. I think that I think that like I can kind of see how you can get there, given a certain kind of moral realism. But like without that, whether we should make that the assumption that like a correct moral theory has all those features is not obvious to me. Maybe it's right, but it's not obvious to me.
Yeah, I mean, so just I would briefly note that. So even if we, I mean, I do adopt that kind of moral realism on which I find it plausible. But even if we're not moral realists, as long as what we care about is something like the moral view that we would find plausible upon reflection, then if the moral view that we currently find plausible would be expected to diverge in ways from the moral view that we would find plausible upon reflection. And so what we would expect is that the particular tenets of the moral view that we would find plausible upon reflection that would diverge from the current moral view, once we really analyze them and consider the arguments for and the arguments against accepting them, that it'll turn out that it's actually really hard to maintain those upon reflection. And I mean, it's a shame because, we, just as the nature of these conversations, we weren't able to get to discuss the sort of full scope of arguments for and against things
I mean,
organ
on
harvesting.
Should we expect the arguments? Should we expect that the moral theory that we're most likely to accept on reflection is going to be one that can be boiled down to a few really, or that is logically entailed by a few very basic principles and all those other things that you just said, is at least not obvious to me, right? I mean, that expectation, like I would have a lot of questions about where it comes from or why I should accept that. I'm not saying we should definitely not, but I'm saying that it's not obvious to me that we should accept that. I do feel pretty sure that we shouldn't harvest people's organs to save other people's lives. That feels obvious, right? That whether the correct moral view is going to be one that has could be extrapolated from relatively few general principles, etc. That feels much less obvious to me.
But okay, I mean, we could keep going forever, and you said an hour, and we've gone for 2 hours. Yeah, sure. I mean, I just say that I think that the moral view that you would hold upon reflection, it's not implausible that it would have some tenets that you currently find repugnant, much like the correct scientific view diverges dramatically from our intuitions. So I think that just giving one or two cases where it's repugnant, without providing further analysis, that would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're going to. I'm sure that it's true that any internally consistent moral view, you're going to lose some intuitions. I don't know how useful the comparison with science is, but I mean, I think that's true. I think that whether the sort of scale of the conflict with a given intuition rises to the level of repugnance, whether that's powerful evidence against it or not, I think we might have a bigger disagreement there.
Okay. All right. I think this has been a fun chat. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for having this chat.
Happy to do it.
Talk to you later.